I knew something was wrong the moment I saw Patricia Morrison standing on my front porch with that smug expression plastered across her face, holding a clipboard like it was some kind of royal decree. It was a Tuesday afternoon in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, and I had just gotten home from my shift at the hospital where I worked as a trauma nurse. My name is William Ingram, and I had been living in the Sunset Ridge community for 3 years without any major issues. Sure, the HOA had their quirks, but nothing that ever made me consider moving. That was about to change. "Good afternoon, William," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false pleasantries. She was the president of our homeowners association, a woman in her early 50s with blonde hair that looked like it had been shellacked into place, and a wardrobe consisting entirely of beige pantsuits. "I need to discuss an important matter with you." I set my gym bag down on the porch and crossed my arms. "What's this about?" She consulted her clipboard with theatrical precision. "The HOA board held an emergency meeting last night, and we've implemented a new safety protocol for all residents of Sunset Ridge. We're requiring all homeowners to provide a copy of their house keys to the association office for emergency access purposes." I stared at her for a moment, certain I had misheard. "You want me to give you a copy of my house keys?" "That's correct," she said, pulling out a form from her clipboard. "It's for your own protection, really. If there's a fire, a flood, or any other emergency when you're not home, we need to be able to access your property to prevent damage to neighboring homes. It's all outlined here in the new bylaws amendment we're implementing." I took the form from her hand and scanned it quickly. The document was dated just 2 days prior and claimed that all homeowners must surrender copies of their keys within 7 days or face fines starting at $500 and escalating weekly. "This wasn't in the original HOA agreement I signed when I bought this place," I said, handing the paper back to her. "You can't just add new requirements like this." Patricia's smile tightened. "Actually, William, if you read Section 12 of your HOA covenant, you'll see that the board has the authority to implement new safety measures as deemed necessary. This is a safety measure. We're not asking for permission, we're informing you of the new requirement." My jaw clenched. I had dealt with difficult people in my line of work before, but there was something particularly grating about Patricia's combination of entitlement and false authority. "I'm not giving you my house keys. That's a massive invasion of privacy." "Then you'll be fined," she said simply, making a note on her clipboard. $500 starting next Tuesday, and the amount will increase by $500 each week until you comply. Additionally, continued non-compliance may result in a lien being placed on your property." She turned to leave, but I called after her. "Who else has agreed to this?" Patricia glanced back over her shoulder. "That's not your concern. What should concern you is avoiding unnecessary fines. Have a good day, William." I watched her walk down my driveway to her white Lexus, feeling my blood pressure rising with each step she took. Once she was gone, I went inside and immediately pulled out my HOA documents. I spent the next 2 hours reading through every page of the covenant, bylaws, and amendments. Section 12 did mention that the board could implement safety measures, but it also specified that any amendments affecting homeowner privacy rights required a vote by at least 60% of the community. The next morning, I called my neighbor, James, who lived 3 houses down. He was a retired police officer who had always been friendly and seemed to have a good read on the neighborhood politics. "Yeah, I got the same visit yesterday," James said when I asked him about the key policy. "Told Patricia exactly where she could stick that clipboard of hers. My wife and I already decided we're not complying. The whole thing is ridiculous. Do you know how many people have actually given them keys? I asked. From what I heard, maybe 6 or 7 families out of the 43 homes here. Most people think it's insane, but Patricia's been going around telling everyone it's mandatory and legal. She's banking on people being too intimidated to push back. I thanked James for the information and decided my next call needed to be to a lawyer. I didn't have a personal attorney, but I knew someone who might be able to help. My sister's husband, Marcus, was a corporate lawyer in Scottsdale, and while HOA law wasn't his specialty, he could point me in the right direction. Marcus answered on the third ring. "Will, what's going on?" I explained the situation, reading him the exact language from both the original covenant and the new form Patricia had delivered. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. "They can't do that," he said finally. "Not legally, anyway. There are very specific circumstances under which an HOA can demand access to your property, and even then, it typically requires notice and specific emergency conditions. Demanding keys with the threat of fines is almost certainly a violation of your property rights. Let me make some calls. I know someone who specializes in HOA disputes." 2 days later, I was sitting in the office of Rebecca Chen, an attorney who had spent the last 15 years representing homeowners in disputes with their associations. She was a sharp woman in her early 40s with an impressive track record of wins against overreaching HOAs. "This is egregious," Rebecca said after reviewing my documents. "Not only is this demand legally questionable, but the way they're trying to implement it violates their own bylaws. They didn't hold a proper vote, they didn't provide adequate notice to the community, and demanding physical keys opens up a whole host of liability issues. What if those keys are stolen? What if someone on the HOA board or office staff misuses them? Your HOA doesn't seem to have thought this through." "So what do we do?" I asked. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, a determined look crossing her face. "We send them a cease and desist letter. We explain exactly why their policy is illegal and demand they rescind it immediately. We also demand they notify all homeowners that the policy is void and that no fines will be assessed. If they push back, we're prepared to file an injunction." "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, already mentally calculating my savings. "Let's start with the letter. $500 for that. If we have to go to court, we'll discuss those fees, but honestly, I don't think it'll get that far. Most HOA boards back down when they realize they're actually breaking the law. They rely on homeowners not knowing their rights." I agreed to proceed, and Rebecca drafted a letter that same day. It was 3 pages of precise legal language explaining why the key demand violated Arizona property law, the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches, and the HOA's own governing documents. She cited specific cases where courts had ruled against HOAs for similar overreach. The letter demanded a response within 5 business days and made it clear that I was prepared to pursue legal action if necessary. Rebecca sent the letter via certified mail and email to both Patricia Morrison and the HOA's registered agent. Then we waited. The response came faster than I expected. 3 days after the letter was sent, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. I was just finishing my coffee before heading to work. "Mr. Ingram, this is Patricia Morrison. I received a very disturbing letter from your attorney." Her tone had lost all pretense of friendliness. She sounded angry, almost shrill. "My attorney laid out why your key policy is illegal," I said calmly. "I suggest you and the board take it seriously." "Your attorney is wrong," Patricia snapped. "We've consulted with our own legal counsel, and we have every right to implement safety measures. Your refusal to comply is putting the entire community at risk." "Then take me to court," I said. I'm not giving you my keys and I'm not paying any fines. If your legal counsel really told you this policy is legal, they're either lying to you or they're incompetent." Patricia made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a snarl. "You're making a very big mistake, Mr. Ingram. The board is prepared to take all necessary action against non-compliant homeowners, and I'm prepared to defend my legal rights. Have a good day, Patricia." I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but I felt oddly satisfied. I had spent years dealing with hostile family members in the emergency room, and I had learned that sometimes you had to stand firm against bullies, even when they wore nice clothes and held clipboards. That evening, I found a notice taped to my front door. It was a formal citation from the HOA stating that I had violated the new emergency access policy and was being assessed a $500 fine. The notice also stated that if I didn't pay within 10 days, the amount would increase to $1,000, and the HOA would begin proceedings to place a lien on my property. I took a photo of the notice and immediately emailed it to Rebecca. Her response came back within an hour. "They're playing with fire. Forward me any additional notices or communications. We may need to move faster than I thought." Over the next week, things escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. I started receiving emails from other homeowners who had heard about my resistance to the key policy. Apparently, word had spread through the neighborhood that someone was actually fighting back against Patricia and the board. Several people reached out to thank me and ask for information about my attorney. James from down the street organized an informal meeting at his house that Friday evening. 15 homeowners showed up, all of them frustrated with the key demand and various other issues with the HOA. "Patricia's been running this association like her personal fiefdom for 3 years," said Margaret, a retired teacher who lived on the corner. "Last year, she tried to fine me because my mailbox wasn't the exact shade of black specified in the guidelines. The paint samples I showed her were identical, but she insisted I repaint it anyway. She sent me a violation notice because my garbage cans were visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup," added David, a software engineer who worked from home. "I had the flu and couldn't bring them in immediately. When I explained, she told me that wasn't an acceptable excuse." The stories kept coming, each one illustrating a pattern of petty tyranny and overreach. It became clear that the key policy wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the latest in a long series of power grabs. "The problem is that most people just pay the fines rather than fight," James said. "Patricia counts on that. She knows most folks don't want the hassle or expense of challenging her." "My attorney thinks we have a strong case," I said. "Not just against the key policy, but potentially against the way the board has been operating. If enough of us are willing to push back together, we might be able to force some real changes." By the end of the meeting, 12 homeowners had agreed to sign on to a potential class action if it became necessary. We exchanged contact information and agreed to keep each other updated on any developments. The following Monday, I received another notice from the HOA. This time, it claimed that my front yard landscaping was not in compliance with community standards. Specifically, it stated that my desert willow tree was excessively unkempt and needed to be trimmed or removed within 14 days. I had planted that tree 2 years ago after getting approval from the Architectural Review Committee. It was healthy, well-maintained, and perfectly in line with the desert landscaping that was standard throughout our Arizona community. The violation notice was clearly retaliation for my refusal to comply with the key policy. I documented everything with photos and timestamps, then forwarded it all to Rebecca. "This is harassment," she said when she called me that evening. "They're targeting you because you're standing up to them. The good news is that this actually strengthens our case. The bad news is that Patricia Morrison doesn't seem like the type to back down easily." "So what's our next move?" I asked. "We file for an injunction. We're going to ask the court to block the HOA from enforcing the key policy, from collecting any fines related to it, and from taking any retaliatory action against you. I'm also going to request attorney's fees if we win, which means the HOA will have to pay for your legal costs." "How long will that take?" "We can file this week. Getting a hearing might take a few weeks, but we can request an emergency temporary restraining order if they continue to escalate." Rebecca was true to her word. She filed the injunction paperwork on Wednesday, and I was served with my copy on Thursday. The legal documents were dense and filled with case law citations, but the core argument was clear. The HOA was violating my constitutional rights and its own governing documents, and the court needed to intervene to prevent irreparable harm. Patricia's response came that Friday afternoon. I was at work when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message simply said, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." I screenshotted the text and forwarded it to Rebecca with a note explaining that I didn't recognize the number, but suspected it was from someone on the HOA board. "Save everything," Rebecca wrote back. "If they're stupid enough to threaten or harass you, that's just more evidence for our case." That weekend, things got worse. On Saturday morning, I came outside to find that someone had spray painted the word "violator" across my driveway in red paint. My security camera footage showed a figure in dark clothing approaching my property at 3 in the morning, spending about 2 minutes with the spray paint, then leaving in a vehicle that was too far away to identify. I called the police immediately. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes and took a report. They examined the footage and agreed that it appeared to be vandalism, though they cautioned that, without a clear view of the perpetrator's face or license plate, it would be difficult to make an arrest. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" the younger officer asked. I explained the ongoing dispute with my HOA, the key policy, and the escalating tensions. Both officers exchanged glances. "I've heard about HOA disputes getting ugly," the older officer said, "but this is definitely crossing a line. If you have any evidence that someone from your HOA board was involved, let us know immediately. Vandalism is a crime, regardless of who committed it." I spent the rest of Saturday cleaning the paint off my driveway, a process that involved a pressure washer, several chemical cleaners, and about 4 hours of work. The entire time, I kept thinking about Patricia's smug face when she had first demanded my keys. This had spiraled far beyond what I ever anticipated. On Sunday, I received an email from the HOA's property management company. It stated that the board had scheduled a hearing for the following Wednesday to discuss my pattern of violations and non-compliance. The email indicated that I had the right to attend and present my case, but the tone made it clear that this was more of a formality than a genuine opportunity for dialogue. I forwarded the email to Rebecca, who responded within an hour despite it being a weekend. "Don't attend that hearing," she wrote. "It's a trap. Anything you say can and will be used against you in their enforcement proceedings. I'll send them a letter stating that you're represented by counsel and that all communication should go through me. Our court date for the injunction is scheduled for 2 weeks from now. They're trying to get ahead of it by ramping up their harassment." Monday morning, Rebecca sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA board, the property management company, and Patricia Morrison personally. The letter outlined the vandalism incident, the suspicious text message, and the retaliatory violation notices. It demanded that all harassment cease immediately, and warned that any further retaliation would result in additional legal claims, including claims for emotional distress and punitive damages. The letter had an effect, but not the one we hoped for. That Tuesday, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, a man named Gerald Hawthorne who practiced in Scottsdale. The letter was dense with legal jargon, but the message was clear. The HOA maintained that its key policy was legal and proper, that I was in violation of multiple community standards, and that if I continued to refuse compliance, they would pursue all available remedies, including foreclosure on my property. The word foreclosure hit me like a physical blow. I knew that HOAs in Arizona had significant power to place liens and even force the sale of properties for unpaid fees, but seeing it in writing from an attorney made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I called Rebecca immediately. "Can they really do this? Can they take my house over keys?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," Rebecca said, and I could hear the anger in her voice. Gerald Hawthorne is a notorious HOA attorney. He represents some of the most aggressive associations in the state, and he's known for bullying tactics. But he's also lost several high-profile cases in the past few years because he overestimates his clients' legal standing. This is posturing. They're trying to scare you into compliance. "It's working," I admitted. "Don't let it. We have a strong case, William. The law is on our side. Hawthorne is counting on you being too intimidated or too financially stretched to fight back. That's how these people win. But you're not alone in this, and we're going to see it through." Her confidence helped, but that night I barely slept. I kept running through worst-case scenarios in my head. What if the court sided with the HOA? What if I ended up losing my home over this ridiculous dispute? I had worked so hard to buy this place, putting in extra shifts at the hospital and saving for years to afford the down payment. The thought of losing it to Patricia Morrison and her power-hungry board was almost unbearable. Wednesday came, and I went to work despite feeling exhausted. My shift at the hospital was busy, which was actually a blessing because it kept my mind occupied. But during my lunch break, I checked my email and found a message from James, my neighbor down the street. "The HOA held that hearing last night about you even though you weren't there," the email read. Patricia read off a list of alleged violations, and the board voted unanimously to impose additional fines totaling $3,000. Several of us who attended tried to speak on your behalf, but we were told the hearing was only for board members and the accused homeowner. Margaret actually got escorted out by security when she refused to leave. This is getting out of control. I showed the email to Rebecca during a phone call that afternoon. She was livid. "They held a hearing without you present. After I explicitly told them you were represented by counsel, that's a violation of basic due process. They're digging themselves deeper with every move they make." "What do we do now?" I asked. "We amend our filing to include these new violations of procedure, and we're going to request an emergency hearing for the injunction. This has gone far enough." True to her word, Rebecca filed an amended complaint that afternoon and requested an emergency hearing. She argued that the HOA was engaging in a pattern of harassment and retaliation that was causing me immediate and irreparable harm. She included copies of all the violation notices, the vandalism police report, the suspicious text message, and James's email about the improper hearing. The court granted the emergency hearing for the following Monday. We would be going before Judge Marilyn Alvarez, a judge Rebecca knew by reputation as being fair but no nonsense. That Thursday evening, I received a knock on my door. When I opened it, I found two men in suits standing on my porch. One was in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive watch. The other was younger, maybe 40, with a briefcase. "William Ingram?" the older man asked. "Who's asking?" "My name is Gerald Hawthorne. I'm the attorney representing the Sunset Ridge HOA. This is Mitchell Crane, the vice president of the HOA board. We'd like to speak with you about resolving this matter." I almost laughed at the audacity. "I'm represented by counsel. All communication should go through my attorney." "We understand that," Hawthorne said smoothly. "But sometimes these situations can be resolved more efficiently through direct conversation. We're not here to threaten or intimidate you. We're here to find a reasonable solution." "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, starting to close the door. Mitchell Crane stepped forward. "Please, Mr. Ingram, just 5 minutes. We can end this whole thing right now. The board is willing to drop all the fines and violation notices if you'll agree to comply with the key policy. That's it. Simple resolution." I paused. Part of me wanted to just give in, to make this nightmare end and go back to my normal life. But I thought about what Rebecca had said about bullies counting on people being too tired to fight. I thought about the other homeowners who were watching to see if anyone could stand up to Patricia and win. "No," I said firmly. "The key policy is illegal and I'm not backing down. If you want to discuss settlement terms, contact my attorney. Now please leave my property." Hawthorne's pleasant expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be, Mr. Ingram. The board has significant legal authority and they're prepared to use it. Then I'll see you in court on Monday. Goodbye." I closed the door and immediately called Rebecca to report the visit. She was furious. "They came to your house after being explicitly told you're represented. That's a violation of legal ethics. I'm filing a complaint with the State Bar Association, and I'm going to mention this to Judge Alvarez on Monday. They just keep making our case stronger." The weekend was tense. I kept looking out my windows, half expecting more vandalism or some other form of retaliation. But Saturday and Sunday passed without incident. I spent most of the time preparing for Monday's hearing, reviewing documents with Rebecca, and going over what to expect. "The HOA will argue that they have broad authority to implement safety measures," Rebecca explained during our Sunday afternoon call. "They'll probably claim that the key policy is similar to emergency access provisions in apartment complexes or gated communities. Our argument is that single-family homes have different privacy expectations, and that their policy violates both statutory law and their own governing documents. Judge Alvarez will likely ask a lot of questions, and she'll want to see evidence of the harassment and retaliation." "Do I need to speak?" I asked nervously. "Probably not much. I'll do most of the talking. But you should be prepared to answer questions if the judge addresses you directly. Just be honest and straightforward." Monday morning arrived with clear Arizona skies and my stomach in knots. I had requested the day off from work, and I arrived at the Maricopa County Courthouse 30 minutes early. Rebecca met me outside, looking professional in a navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with documents. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." We went through security and made our way to the third-floor courtroom. Patricia Morrison was already there, sitting in the gallery with Mitchell Crane, and another woman I recognized as Denise Whitmore, the HOA secretary. Gerald Hawthorne sat at the defense table, reviewing a stack of papers. Judge Alvarez took the bench promptly at 9 o'clock. She was a Hispanic woman in her late 50s with dark hair pulled back in a bun and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Good morning," she said. "We're here on the matter of Ingram versus Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association. I've reviewed the filings from both parties. Counsel, I'm particularly interested in hearing arguments about the legal basis for the key policy and the allegations of retaliation. Miss Chen, you may proceed. Rebecca stood and launched into her argument. She was articulate and passionate, walking the judge through the relevant property law, constitutional issues, and the HOA's own governing documents. She pointed out that the key policy had been implemented without a proper vote, that it violated reasonable expectations of privacy, and that the association had failed to provide adequate safeguards for how the keys would be stored and who would have access to them. Your Honor, this isn't about whether homeowners associations can implement safety measures, Rebecca said. It's about whether they can do so in a way that tramples on fundamental property rights. Demanding physical keys to private homes, with the threat of escalating fines and foreclosure, goes far beyond what the law allows. Hawthorne countered by arguing that HOAs had broad discretion to manage their communities, and that the key policy was a reasonable safety measure. He cited several cases where courts had upheld HOA authority to access properties in emergencies. The cases you're citing involve very different circumstances, Judge Alvarez interrupted. They deal with emergency access after specific incidents had occurred, not blanket demands for keys in advance. Can you show me any Arizona case law that supports requiring homeowners to turn over keys prophylactically? Hawthorne hesitated, flipping through his notes. Your Honor, the principle is the same. The HOA has a duty to protect all properties in the community, and this policy serves that purpose. What about the allegations of retaliation? The judge asked. Miss Chen has provided evidence of multiple violation notices issued immediately after her client refused to comply, along with a vandalism incident and communications that suggest harassment. How do you respond to that? Those are separate matters, Your Honor. If Mr. Ingram is in violation of community standards, the HOA has an obligation to enforce those standards regardless of any ongoing dispute. Judge Alvarez looked skeptical. She turned to me. Mr. Ingram, you were cited for your landscaping. How long have you lived at this property? I stood, my voice steadier than I felt. 3 years, Your Honor. And how long has that tree been there? 2 years. I got approval from the architectural committee before planting it. Has anyone complained about it before this dispute over the keys? No, Your Honor. She made a note and looked back at Hawthorne. Counsel, this appears to be exactly the kind of retaliation Miss Chen is alleging. Your client implements a legally questionable policy, a homeowner objects, and suddenly he's being hit with violation notices for things that were never problems before. I'm also troubled by the fact that the HOA held a disciplinary hearing after being informed that Mr. Ingram was represented by counsel, and without allowing him or his attorney to participate. The homeowner was invited to attend, Hawthorne protested. After his attorney told you all communication should go through her, and without providing adequate notice to counsel. That's a due process violation, and you know it. The judge reviewed her notes for a long moment. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of papers rustling. I'm going to grant the injunction, Judge Alvarez finally said. The HOA is hereby ordered to cease enforcement of the key policy immediately. All fines assessed against Mr. Ingram related to this policy are vacated. The HOA is further ordered to send notice to all homeowners that the key policy is not in effect and that no penalties will be imposed for non-compliance. Patricia Morrison made a noise of protest from the gallery, but Mitchell Crane grabbed her arm and whispered something urgently in her ear. Furthermore, the judge continued, I'm ordering the HOA to refrain from any retaliatory actions against Mr. Ingram. That means no violation notices, no fines, no disciplinary hearings unless there is clear and convincing evidence of an actual violation that would have been enforced prior to this dispute. I'm also awarding attorney's fees to the plaintiff. Miss Chen, submit your fee statement within 10 days. She looked at both attorneys. This is a classic case of an HOA board overstepping its authority and then retaliating against a homeowner who dared to push back. I expect the Sunset Ridge Board to take this ruling seriously and to review their governance practices. If I see Mr. Ingram back in this courtroom because of continued harassment, there will be serious consequences, including potential sanctions against the board members personally. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor, Rebecca said. Hawthorne nodded stiffly. Yes, Your Honor. Good. This matter is concluded. The judge stood, and we all rose as she exited the courtroom. As soon as she was gone, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Rebecca turned to me with a genuine smile. We won, she said simply. Patricia Morrison stormed out of the courtroom without a word, Denise Whitmore hurrying after her. Mitchell Crane lingered for a moment, looking like he wanted to say something, but then thought better of it and left. Hawthorne packed up his briefcase and approached us. Your client got lucky today, he said to Rebecca. My client was right, Rebecca replied coolly. There's a difference. Maybe you should advise your clients more carefully before encouraging them to violate people's constitutional rights. Hawthorne's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He simply walked away. Outside the courthouse, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of relief. Thank you, I said to Rebecca. I don't know what I would have done without you. You would have figured it out, she said, but I'm glad I could help. This is exactly why I do this kind of work. HOAs can serve legitimate purposes, but when they are run by people like Patricia Morrison who treat them as personal kingdoms, someone needs to push back. What happens now? I asked. The HOA has to comply with the court order. They'll send out notice about the key policy being rescinded, and they'll have to pay my fees. They might try to appeal, but they'd lose. Judge Alvarez's ruling was thorough and well-reasoned. Any appellate court would uphold it. Over the next few days, I watched as the fallout from the court ruling played out. True to Judge Alvarez's order, the HOA sent an email to all residents stating that the emergency access key policy was no longer in effect, and that any homeowners who had already provided keys could come retrieve them from the property management office. But more significantly, the ruling seemed to embolden other homeowners who had been quietly frustrated with Patricia's leadership. Within a week, a petition began circulating calling for a special election to recall the entire HOA board. The petition needed signatures from at least 30% of homeowners to trigger a vote, and it reached that threshold in just 5 days. James called me on Friday evening, excitement clear in his voice. Have you heard? We got enough signatures. There's going to be a recall vote next month. That's amazing, I said. Do you think it'll pass? I think it has a real shot. People are angry, Will. The key policy was just the most recent example of Patricia going too far. A lot of folks have been dealing with petty fines and ridiculous enforcement for years. You standing up to them showed everyone that the board isn't invincible. The recall election was scheduled for 6 weeks later, on a Thursday evening at the community center. In the meantime, life slowly returned to normal. I went back to work, caught up on sleep, and tried to put the stress of the legal battle behind me. But I made sure to stay involved in the neighborhood, attending the informal meetings that James continued to organize and encouraging other homeowners to participate in the upcoming vote. Patricia Morrison, for her part, went into full campaign mode. She and her supporters on the board sent out lengthy emails defending their record and characterizing the recall effort as a vindictive response to necessary governance. She claimed that the key policy had been a misunderstood attempt to protect the community, and that the court ruling had been based on technicalities rather than the merits of the policy itself. Most homeowners saw through the spin, but Patricia's core supporters remained loyal. They were mostly older residents who had served on various HOA committees over the years, and who seemed to view any challenge to board authority as a personal affront. The night of the recall vote, the community center was packed. Nearly every homeowner in Sunset Ridge showed up, some bringing spouses and adult children who lived with them. The tension in the room was palpable. A representative from the property management company served as the neutral moderator. The voting was done by written ballot, with each homeowner receiving 1 vote per property owned. Patricia and her board members sat at a table at the front of the room, looking defiant. Before the voting began, Patricia was given an opportunity to address the community. She stood at a podium, her posture rigid, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I have served this community faithfully for 3 years," she said. "Every decision I and this board have made has been in the best interest of maintaining our property values and ensuring Sunset Ridge remains a desirable place to live. The recall effort is being driven by a small group of malcontents who don't want to follow reasonable rules. If you remove this board, you'll be replacing experienced leadership with chaos." When she finished, James stood up from the audience. "I'd like to respond to that if I may." The moderator nodded. "You have 2 minutes." James walked to the front, his retired cop bearing evident in his confident stride. "Patricia talks about experience, but experience doesn't mean much if it's used to bully and intimidate. This recall isn't about one policy or one person. It's about a pattern of overreach and abuse of authority. It's about violation notices issued for minor issues while real problems get ignored. It's about a board that doesn't listen to homeowners and treats this community like subjects rather than neighbors. We deserve better." The room erupted in applause, and Patricia's face turned red. After a few more brief comments from other homeowners on both sides, the moderator called for voting to begin. People lined up to submit their ballots, a process that took about 30 minutes. The votes were counted by the property management representative and 2 randomly selected homeowners who had agreed to serve as neutral observers. The room was silent as they tallied the results. Finally, the moderator stood and read from a paper. Total ballots cast, 39. Votes in favor of recalling the board, 32. Votes against recall, 7. The motion passes. The current board is removed from office immediately. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Patricia Morrison grabbed her purse and stormed out without a word, Denise Whitmore following her. Mitchell Crane stayed behind, looking shell-shocked. A temporary interim board was appointed that night, consisting of 5 homeowners who had agreed to serve until a formal election could be held in 3 months. James was appointed interim president. Margaret, the retired teacher, became vice president. In the parking lot after the meeting, several people came up to thank me for standing up to the old board. It felt surreal. I had just wanted to keep my house keys and live in peace. But somehow I had become the catalyst for a community-wide change. 3 months later, the formal election was held. James ran for president and won by a comfortable margin. The new board immediately set about reviewing all existing HOA policies and rules, identifying which ones were reasonable and which ones had been exercises in petty control. They also implemented new transparency measures, including monthly open board meetings and a requirement that any new policy changes be put to a community vote if they affected homeowner privacy or property rights. One of the new board's first acts was to commission an audit of the HOA's finances. What they found was disturbing. Patricia Morrison had been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including meals, gas, and even a vacation to California that she had claimed was for a homeowners association conference. The total amount of misappropriated funds was over $12,000. James called me as soon as the audit results came back. "We need to report this," he said. "This is embezzlement." I agreed, and the new board filed a report with the Phoenix Police Department. Detective Sarah Kowalski was assigned to the case. She was a veteran investigator with the White Collar Crimes Unit, and she took the matter seriously. The investigation took 2 months. Detective Kowalski subpoenaed bank records, credit card statements, and receipts. She interviewed Patricia, who initially denied everything but eventually hired her own lawyer and stopped cooperating. The evidence was overwhelming. In September, Patricia Morrison was arrested and charged with 3 counts of theft and 2 counts of fraudulent schemes. The charges carried potential prison time. The legal process moved slowly, as these things do. Patricia's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the county attorney's office wasn't willing to let her off with just probation. She had stolen from an organization she was supposed to serve, and they wanted accountability. The case finally went to trial in January of the following year. I was called as a witness, not because of the financial crimes, but to testify about Patricia's conduct during the key policy dispute. The prosecutor wanted to establish a pattern of abuse of authority and disregard for rules. Sitting in the witness box, I recounted the whole saga: the initial demand for keys, the retaliatory violation notices, the improper hearing, the vandalism that was never solved but that everyone suspected was connected to the dispute. Patricia sat at the defense table, looking smaller somehow than she had when she stood on my porch with that clipboard. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Patricia Morrison guilty on all counts. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge gave her 18 months in prison followed by 2 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus fines and court costs. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I felt no satisfaction, only a kind of sad relief. This had never been about revenge or punishment. It had been about standing up for basic rights and refusing to be bullied. The new HOA board continued to make positive changes. They reduced the overall number of rules by about 40%, eliminating the petty regulations that had served no purpose except to generate violations and fines. They implemented a common-sense approach to enforcement, focusing on genuine issues that affected property values or safety rather than nitpicking minor aesthetic choices. Property values in Sunset Ridge actually increased slightly over the next year, not because of strict enforcement, but because people wanted to live in a community that wasn't run like a police state. The neighborhood felt friendlier, more relaxed. People actually talked to each other instead of worrying about being reported for minor infractions. As for me, I continued working at the hospital and living in my house with my keys safely in my pocket where they belonged. I never sought any kind of leadership role in the HOA, but I stayed involved in community meetings and made sure to vote in every election. The experience had taught me that apathy is what allows petty tyrants to flourish, and that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. One evening about 2 years after the whole ordeal began, I was sitting on my front porch watching the Arizona sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. James walked by walking his dog and stopped to chat. "You ever think about how different things would be if you'd just given them your keys?" he asked. I considered it. "Yeah, sometimes. My life would have been a lot less stressful for a while." But Patricia would still be on the board, still abusing her authority, still making people miserable over nonsense. Someone had to say no. James nodded. "I'm glad it was you. Not many people have the guts to fight back like that." "I think more people do than you'd expect," I said. "They just need to see that it's possible to win." We talked for a few more minutes before James continued his walk. I stayed on the porch, enjoying the cool evening air and the quiet peace of my neighborhood. In the distance, I could hear kids playing, someone mowing their lawn, the normal sounds of suburban life. My house keys were on the table beside me, attached to a keychain my sister had given me for Christmas. It had a small plaque that read, "Home Sweet Home." I picked them up, feeling their familiar weight in my palm, and smiled. They were mine, and they were staying that way. The following months brought a sense of normalcy that I had almost forgotten was possible. The new HOA board operated with transparency and common sense, addressing actual issues like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events, rather than micromanaging everyone's lives. The spring community barbecue drew the largest turnout in years, with families actually enjoying themselves instead of worrying about being cited for parking violations. Rebecca Chen called me occasionally to check in, and we had developed a genuine friendship beyond the attorney-client relationship. She told me that my case had become something of a teaching example in HOA law circles, illustrating both the limits of association authority and the importance of homeowners knowing their rights. "I've had 3 new clients in the past year who specifically mentioned your case," she said during one of our catch-up lunches. "They heard that someone actually fought back and won, and it gave them courage to stand up for themselves. That's the real victory here, Will. You changed the culture." I had also reconnected with some extended family who lived in other parts of Arizona. My cousin drove down from Flagstaff to visit, and when I told him the whole story, he was amazed. His own HOA had tried to implement some questionable rules, and hearing about my experience inspired him to get more involved in his community's governance rather than just complaining from the sidelines. The property management company that had handled Sunset Ridge also underwent changes. They apparently realized that supporting overreaching boards was bad for business, and they implemented new training for their community managers about legal limits on HOA authority. It was a small victory, but victories often are. By the time the second anniversary of Judge Alvarez's ruling came around, Sunset Ridge had become something of a model community. Other HOAs in the Phoenix metro area actually reached out to James and the board to learn about how they had restructured their governance. Several news outlets ran stories about the transformation from HOA nightmare to neighborhood dream. I declined most interview requests, preferring to stay out of the spotlight, but I did agree to speak at a homeowner rights seminar that Rebecca organized. Standing in front of a room of about 50 people who were dealing with their own HOA disputes, I shared my story and the lessons I had learned. "The most important thing I can tell you is this: don't be afraid to stand up for your rights," I said. "Document everything, know your governing documents, and find a good attorney if you need one. These boards count on you being too intimidated or too tired to fight. But when you stand firm on legitimate legal ground, they usually back down because they know they can't win." The questions afterward were thoughtful and engaged. People wanted to know about specific tactics, about costs, about how to build community support. I answered as honestly as I could, emphasizing that every situation was different but that the underlying principles remained the same. One woman in her 30s raised her hand. "How did you deal with the stress? I'm fighting my HOA over a fence dispute, and it's affecting my sleep and my family life." I nodded, remembering those sleepless nights before the court hearing. "It's hard," I admitted. There were times I questioned whether it was worth it, but I found that having a clear sense of what I was fighting for helped. This wasn't about pride or winning an argument. It was about protecting my fundamental right to privacy in my own home. When you're standing on solid ground like that, it makes it easier to endure the stress. After the seminar, several people came up to thank me personally. One man shook my hand vigorously and said I had given him hope. It was humbling and gratifying in equal measure. Life continued to move forward. I got promoted to senior trauma nurse at the hospital, a position that came with more responsibility, but also more flexibility in my schedule. I started dating someone I met through a friend, a teacher named Lisa who had no connection to my neighborhood drama and found the whole story both appalling and hilarious in equal measure. "You went to court over house keys," she said when I first told her the story over dinner. "It sounds crazy when you put it that way," I admitted. "But it was never really about the keys. It was about boundaries and authority and not letting someone else control my private property." She understood, and we laughed about Patricia Morrison's eventual fate. 18 months in prison for HOA tyranny and embezzlement, Lisa said. "There's probably a cable movie in there somewhere." The holidays that year were particularly meaningful. The Sunset Ridge HOA organized a neighborhood lights contest. But unlike previous years under Patricia's regime, it was actually fun rather than stressful. The rules were simple and reasonable, and the focus was on community spirit rather than rigid compliance. My modest string of white lights along the roofline didn't win any prizes, but I enjoyed walking around the neighborhood in the evenings admiring everyone's creativity. On Christmas Eve, I attended the neighborhood caroling event at the community center. James and Margaret had organized it, and about 30 residents showed up. We walked the streets singing slightly off-key versions of holiday classics, and several homeowners came out to join us or offer hot chocolate. It felt like the kind of neighborhood experience you see in movies but rarely encounter in real life. Standing in front of the community center afterward, warming my hands on a cup of cider, I reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. The same houses stood in the same places, but the atmosphere was completely different. People smiled and waved instead of avoiding eye contact. Kids played in yards without parents worrying about violation notices for toys left out. It was what a community was supposed to be. Mitchell Crane, the former vice president who had accompanied Patricia on that attempted settlement visit to my house, approached me somewhat hesitantly. He had stayed in the neighborhood despite the board recall, keeping a low profile. "William, I wanted to apologize," he said. "I should have stood up to Patricia years ago. I knew a lot of what she was doing was wrong, but I convinced myself it was easier to go along. I'm sorry you had to be the one to fight that battle." I appreciated his honesty. "Thank you for saying that. I think a lot of people felt the same way." The system made it easier to comply than to resist. "Still, you did the right thing. I just wanted you to know I recognize that now." We shook hands, and I felt another piece of the past settle into place. As winter turned to spring and then summer, I found myself thinking less and less about the HOA dispute. It had become part of my history rather than my present, a story I told when relevant, but not something that dominated my thoughts. The healing was gradual but real. One afternoon in July, I was mowing my front lawn when a car pulled up and a young couple got out. They looked at the house across the street that had recently gone up for sale. "Excuse me," the woman called to me. "Do you live in this neighborhood?" I turned off the mower and walked over. "Yes, I've been here about 4 years now." "How's the HOA?" the man asked. "We've heard horror stories about some associations in Phoenix." I smiled. "It's actually really good now. It went through some changes a couple years back, but the current board is reasonable and focused on the right things. I'd recommend the neighborhood." They looked relieved and thanked me for the information. As they drove away to meet their realtor, I realized that I had just genuinely recommended living in Sunset Ridge. 2 years ago, I might have been looking to move myself. The transformation really was complete. That evening, I sat down and wrote a letter to Judge Marilyn Alvarez. I knew she probably received hundreds of letters, but I wanted her to know the impact her ruling had made. I described how the neighborhood had changed, how other homeowners had been inspired to stand up for their rights, and how her clear statement of legal principles had created ripples far beyond just my individual case. I sent the letter to the courthouse, not expecting a response, but a few weeks later I received a brief note back. It was handwritten on courthouse stationery. "Mr. Ingram, thank you for your kind letter. It's gratifying to know that the legal system worked as it should in your case. Remember that the real credit belongs to you for having the courage to stand up for your rights. Continue to be a good citizen and neighbor. Best wishes, Judge Marilyn Alvarez." I framed that note and hung it in my home office, a reminder of what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept injustice. As summer faded into fall, I received word that Patricia Morrison had been released from prison after serving 14 months of her 18-month sentence, with time off for good behavior. According to the grapevine, she had moved to Tucson to live with her sister and was working as a retail clerk. I felt a mix of emotions hearing that news, but mostly I felt nothing. She was no longer part of my life or my community, and that was exactly how it should be. The HOA held its annual meeting in October, and I attended along with most of the neighborhood. James was re-elected as president unanimously. During his address to the community, he mentioned the journey the association had taken over the past couple of years. "We learned some hard lessons about the difference between leadership and control," James said. "This board serves you, the homeowners. We're not here to tell you how to live or to nickel and dime you with petty fines. We're here to maintain our common areas, handle necessary community business, and otherwise stay out of your way. That's what an HOA should be." The applause that followed was genuine and enthusiastic. After the meeting, several of us went out for drinks at a nearby restaurant. The conversation flowed easily, covering everything from sports to politics to neighborhood gossip. At one point, Margaret raised her glass in a toast to William for having the guts to say no when it mattered. Everyone clinked glasses, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the beer. These were my neighbors, my community, and I had played a role in making it a better place. That was worth all the stress and sleepless nights. Driving home that night, I took the long way through the neighborhood, past houses decorated with Halloween displays, past the park where kids still played even though it was getting late, past the community pool that would close for the season soon. Everything looked peaceful and normal, exactly as a neighborhood should look. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at my house. It wasn't the fanciest house in Sunset Ridge, but it was mine. The mortgage was in my name, the keys were in my pocket, and no one could take that away from me. Inside, I made dinner and settled in to watch a baseball game. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa asking about my weekend plans. I smiled and texted back, already looking forward to spending time with her. Life was good. The battle was over, the tyrant was gone, and the community had healed. Sometimes the good guys really do win, I thought. You just have to be willing to fight. The years that followed continued in that same peaceful vein. I eventually married Lisa in a ceremony held at the Sunset Ridge Community Center, with neighbors and friends filling the room. James officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. It was small and perfect, and everything a wedding should be. We stayed in my house, which became our house. Lisa taught 5th grade at a nearby elementary school and brought her own warmth and energy to the neighborhood. She became friends with many of the other residents, organizing a book club and volunteering for various community events. The HOA continued to function smoothly under James's leadership, and then under his successors, when he eventually stepped down after serving 3 years. The culture of reasonableness and respect had taken firm root, outlasting any individual board member. I never did find out for certain who vandalized my driveway that night during the height of the dispute. The police case remained unsolved, though everyone had their suspicions. In the end, it didn't really matter. That chapter was closed, and I had no desire to reopen it. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I would think about how different my life might have been if I had just complied with Patricia's demand. If I had handed over my keys and paid the fines and kept my head down, I probably would have avoided a lot of stress and expense. But I also would have lived in a neighborhood controlled by a petty tyrant, and I would have had to live with the knowledge that I had surrendered my rights without a fight. No, I thought during those quiet moments, I made the right choice. It was hard, but it was right. And that was the lesson I hoped others would take from my story. Standing up for your rights is rarely easy. There will be people who tell you it's not worth the fight, that you should just go along to get along. But some principles are worth defending, and privacy in your own home is one of them. The house keys that had started it all still hung on the same hook by my front door, joined now by Lisa's keys, and a growing collection of keychains from places we had visited together. They represented security, autonomy, and the simple freedom to live your life without someone looking over your shoulder and demanding compliance. Years later, when friends or acquaintances asked me about living in an HOA community, I always told them the same thing. Read your governing documents carefully, know your rights, and don't be afraid to push back against overreach. Most HOAs are reasonable, but when you encounter one that isn't, you have more power than you think. The story of William Ingram versus the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association became something of a local legend, referenced in legal briefs and homeowner rights workshops across Arizona and beyond. But for me, it was simply a difficult chapter in my life that I survived and learned from. I never regretted standing my ground. Not when Patricia Morrison first knocked on my door with her clipboard and her demands. Not during the sleepless nights worrying about losing my home. Not during the court hearings or the community upheaval that followed. Every moment of stress had been worth it to establish the principle that homeowners have rights that even associations must respect, and in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the victory itself, but what it represented, the power of an ordinary person to stand up to institutional overreach and win. The knowledge that courage and legal principles could prevail over bullying and intimidation. As I locked my front door each night, keys in hand, I was reminded of that lesson. These were my keys, this was my home, and no one could take that away from me. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the grand scheme of life, but small things matter. Freedom lies in the details, in the everyday choices about how we live and who gets to control those choices. Patricia Morrison had learned that the hard way, sitting in a prison cell for crimes born of unchecked authority and hubris. The Sunset Ridge community had learned it too, emerging from years of petty tyranny into something healthier and more democratic. And I had learned that sometimes the hardest choice is also the right one, that standing alone is better than compromising your principles, and that you never know how many people are waiting for someone else to be brave first. The sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant colors as it did every evening. Inside my home, with my wife beside me and my keys safely in my pocket, I felt the deep satisfaction of knowing I had fought for something that mattered and won. That was enough. That was everything.